You're listening to episode 21 of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, all about how to develop healthy relationships with your children and stepchildren. Here's a sneak peek into today's episode.
And so it's so vitally important to really recognize that differences are okay and that we're going to need to parent every child differently.
Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer. My co-host is Holly Kane, and together we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. We're so glad you're here with us. Hi friend, I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I am so glad you're here with us today. We are continuing in our Healthy Relationship series, and I'm so excited to share this episode with you because I know that many of you listening are moms and or stepmoms. And as we get ready to wrap up this series, we didn't want to neglect this conversation about parenting because our relationships with our kids or stepchildren definitely have an impact on our leadership. So today, my guest is Gayla Grace, and she is the director and co-founder of the Sisterhood of Stepmoms. As a mom and stepmom, Gayla is going to share with us her insights on how to nurture strong connections with our children, some of the unique challenges that stepmoms face, and some common mistakes that parents make. Gayla also shares with us about how her faith has impacted her motherhood and her leadership journey. And I know you will love the practical habit that she has developed that helps her to be reminded of God's work in her life, even when her memory doesn't always serve her well. I also really love what Gayla shares as an encouragement to all women in leadership, and I know it'll encourage you as well. So in case you don't know about our guest, let me just tell you a little bit about her. Gayla is, like I said before, the director and co-founder of Sisterhood of Stepmoms, a nonprofit organization designed to create community and provide national retreats for stepmothers. She holds a master's degree in psychology and counseling, and she recently published her latest book, Stepparenting With Grace. She also has founded stepparentingwithgrace.com more than a decade ago, and she offers coaching services, resources, and encouragement to stepfamilies. Gayla and her husband, Randy, have 5 children in their blended family. Before we jump into this conversation, I want to let you know that this episode is brought to you by Morningstar Media Services, which is the business that I founded and operate. And I'm excited to share with you that we are specializing in podcast management services for business owners. You can learn more about what we do at morningstarmediaservices.com. As usual, you can get the show notes for this episode at estherlittlefield.com/episode 21. Now let's jump in to the conversation with Gayla Grace about developing healthy relationships with our kids and stepkids. Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. Today, I am here with Gayla Grace. And Gayla, I'm so excited to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm thankful to be here, Esther.
Yes, great. So we are continuing in our Healthy Relationship series, and I'm happy to have Gayla here today because she's going to share with us about her leadership journey, but also about parenting and step-parenting, which I think is something that will impact and help a lot of us. So Gayla, as we're getting started, I'd love for you to share with us just a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. Well, I am a Southern gal. I was raised in Texas, and we now live in Louisiana. And I have been a mom, a stepmom, a wife. I am now an author. I also have a leadership background in regards to, I started as Assistant Director of Human Resources for Coca-Cola years ago, just fresh out of college, moved into a Human Resources Director role. And that's really where I learned to be a leader. I learned to understand what it means to serve others as you lead. And I feel that that really helped me just as I moved on into other positions, but then also I feel like it helped me as a mom and
Yeah.
some things that I learned in my own family as a wife. And there were just so many parallels between leading that we can also carry over into our home life. And I enjoy doing that and kind of looking at the parallels.
Awesome. That's great. So, yeah, so you mentioned a little bit about how you got started in leadership with Coca-Cola. So tell us a little bit more about your leadership journey and where God has brought you to today.
When I was working at Coca-Cola, I loved that job, but it was stressful. You can imagine anytime you're in a big corporation like that, there are a lot of expectations. And during that time is when I began to have my children, and I began to explore that maybe there were other directions that I might go. I began to pray about the direction God might have me, because I felt strongly about being in place as a mom. And during that time, later, is when I decided to go back to school and get my master's degree in psychology and counseling. I was drawn towards understanding behavior.
Yeah.
And I still, to this day, I think it's fascinating for us to understand behavior and what drives behavior in people. And that has been part of my leadership journey, then even in some other positions I took in other companies where I was in customer service for a while in a leadership role. And so often as we're leading others and we look at behavior and things that are going on, we have to consider what's behind behavior sometimes. And it's not just that they are having a bad day and they're reflecting an attitude maybe towards us. We have to consider, but what else is going on? Is there something that we can get them to talk to us about that is driving that disagreeable behavior? And I think that is so important as leaders that we consider that we don't just right off the bat start thinking, gosh, I don't like this behavior. This needs to be fixed. I just think we need to consider what's behind it. And that is something that I've carried with me as a leader, and that then I've also tried to carry over in a mom, a stepmom, a wife role also.
Yeah, that's a powerful thing to be reminded of. There is always something driving the behavior, and I think having that openness to be curious about it is key.
Right.
Like you said, in both leadership and parenting. So that's
Right.
awesome.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a history. I mean, even in people that you are leading, there is a history of previous jobs that they've had, previous leaders that they've had, and maybe there is a not so great history. And so there's some trust issues that they have. And we have to really consider how to build trust in those that are looking to us as leaders. So all of those things come into play.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So you shared a little bit about your job history as well as your education. Are there any other life events that have contributed to your leadership?
Well, I became a Christian at a very young age. I was raised in a Christian home, a very stable home, which honestly, I didn't realize how thankful to be for that until I've become an adult. And I've gotten to know other people who didn't grow up like that, and they were in an unstable home. And my home life has really contributed towards me, for one, having a very strong faith that I've carried with me through all of my experiences. And I have been able to trust in a loving God who I know wants and has the best in store for me at all times. And a lot of that does go back to my upbringing. I had Christian parents who were married for 65 years. And so all of that played a role in stability that I think has helped me as an adult.
Wow. Yeah, that's so it's such a great reminder, especially as we think about parenting on this episode, that the impact that we can have on our kids by
Right.
providing them with that stability.
Well, and the
So,
model that we can show in marriage, because they may not see that model other places, especially as they move into their teenage years and they're really watching us. They're watching others too. And the model that we can show is just so important.
yeah, yeah. Okay. So, one of the reasons I wanted to chat with you is about this issue of parenting and step parenting, because I know that you have written a book about it and you have a lot of experience. Tell me the kids that you have, and then, yeah.
Yes. So my husband and Randy and I have been married 23 years. We
Okay.
had both been married before and brought two kids into the marriage. So I had two young girls when we married. My daughters were 3 and 5. Randy had two children when we married, and his kids were 5 and 10. And then we had a child together 6 years later. So we now have 5 kids ranging in age from 17 to 33. We just have one child at home, which is the biological child we have had together.
Okay.
And in the stepfamily world, we are what's called a his, hers, and ours family, because we have kids from all directions.
Yeah.
And Randy and I both had custody of our kids when we married. So we went very quickly into blending families. I went from having 2 kids full time to having 4 kids. And that's a huge adjustment. There's just, even though I love kids and I'm thinking, oh gosh, I can parent 2 more, that's no big deal. It was a big deal.
Right.
And understanding blended family dynamics is a big deal. And understanding how to parent in a blended family home with kids that you didn't raise.
Yeah.
Huge. And there are just some challenges that go along with that. That is why I have such a passion about helping step families, because it's just not easy. And we experienced a significant amount of bumps ourselves in the early years.
Okay, great. So I want to get into the step parenting, but if we can just pull back for 1 second, and I'd love for you to share if you have any thoughts on more generally how parents can develop healthy relationships with their kids. And then maybe we'll move to the step parenting after that.
Okay. Some of it, some of it is going to be the same, whether it's your own kids or it's stepkids, because we have to consider our personalities, our children's personalities. They're not necessarily going to be just like us, and that's okay. In fact, really, I don't want kids that are just like me. It might be easier to parent them, but it also, the world thrives on differences. And so we need to recognize, we all talk about the introverts and extroverts, but there's some real differences in introverts and extroverts and how we do life. And so just because we have a child who is different than us, and maybe they don't want to attend every function at their school, maybe they don't want to be involved in every club like we were as a teenager, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with our child. It just means they're a little different than we are. And so it's so vitally important to really recognize that differences are okay, and that we're going to need to parent every child differently. Even though I have 3 biological children, my children are very different than each other. And I had to learn how to parent them. I have 2 daughters and a son. Even that in itself is different. The drama that can happen for girls during their teenage years is huge. Yeah. And then now raising our son, he does not want to be into drama, but he's into technology. And, that has some issues with it, especially in today's world. We have to stay on top of what is impacting our kids. And the thing that has really changed, even from when we raised our older kids, is how technology affects them. And we have to stay on top of that and realize, for one, the dangers of it, but also the advantages of it. Just a prime example is when we raised our older kids, you didn't have all of these apps where you could see them once they start driving. Yeah. And now, I can see where my 17-year-old son is based on this app that he and I share. And he had to agree to share that app if he wanted to keep that phone that we pay for. So, those are advantages. Those are things that have changed, that I just think it's so important for us to just be mindful of how personalities might be different than ours, and that we're going to need to parent every child differently.
Yeah, I love that you pointed that out. It's funny that you mentioned the introvert and extrovert thing. We were just having a discussion about this last night at dinner, because both my husband and I are introverts. And so, long days at church or big events with lots and lots of people would just tires us both out. And we're pretty sure that our daughter is an extrovert. And so we were talking about it at dinner, and I described the difference between the 2, introvert and extrovert. And she said, yeah, I think I'm an extrovert. And I was pretty impressed that she was able to identify, because that has been a challenge for me as a parent to realize that she needs that interaction and sometimes I need the space. And so it's tricky. So I think that's such a key point. And
honestly, it's kind of unusual, Esther, for you and your husband both to be introverts, because it's really very common in a marriage to have an introvert and an extrovert.
Right.
And so then you have two people that have to figure out how to do life together, because that's how I'm an introvert and my husband is very extroverted.
Yeah.
And we have really had to figure out how to, especially like on vacations, I can't just go and be around people all the time like he can. And so he's had to understand how to serve me in that area, but I also have to learn how to serve him in that area. It can't be all about our needs. We have to consider the other one too.
Yeah. Yes. So true. So true. So you mentioned in terms of parenting, the technology issue. And I just love to hear if you have any words of wisdom for parents navigating that, maybe in the teen years, and any tips on navigating dealing with technology with your kids.
I think one thing is to be sure you put some boundaries in place. For instance, once they have phones, they don't need to have those phones in their rooms at night, because gosh, pornography is so readily available. And we can't just stick our head in the sand and think, well, I'm raising my son in the church and he's being exposed to teaching. He knows this is wrong. But the truth is, he's going to be exposed to it somewhere. It just is part of society now. And so we need to be sure that we have some boundaries in place that can limit it whenever possible. We've always been advocates of having the computer in a main room also. Our children have never had a computer in their room. I don't think that's a good idea. But the truth is, a phone is a mini computer.
Yes.
And so we need to recognize that. So if we're allowing them to just have that phone 24/7, we're really opening some doors to what they are being exposed to. So the boundary setting is one. There's all kinds of safe programs that you can install out there. There's also ways you can look at history. If you suspect that maybe your child is on some sites they shouldn't be, there is a way that you can go in and look at that. And, even if we're not the most savvy parent technology-wise, I bet we have a friend who is, or we have somebody from the church who can help us, because all of us are dealing with these issues now. The other thing with boys is in regards to these games. There's some research out there that really shows the danger of violent video games. Particularly certain personalities are going to be more affected by those than others. And, kids get desensitized when they are just watching these violent games. All of a sudden, it just feels like, well, this is just how you do life. And so then you read news reports of a 6-year-old who shot his 9-year-old brother because he didn't allow him on the computer when he should have. I mean, this is a real story from like a week ago that I saw. Wow. And all I can think about is, I wonder what games they're playing that they're so desensitized, and I'm just going to pick up a gun and shoot you because that's what I do in my video games.
Yeah.
So I just think we really need to be aware of what our kids are exposed to and how those things affect them, and just be mindful of that.
Yeah.
But technology is a big deal.
Yeah.
But then the flip side of it, like I mentioned, is there are some advantages to it. There are apps that we can put on the phones that can help us see what's going on, can help us know if our kids are where they're supposed to be, and all that good stuff.
Yeah. I think the main point that you're bringing here is just to educate yourself, to be aware, to stay apprised of what is out there and what you can use to your benefit, and also what might be harmful to your kids.
Right. And the other thing is, if they are on certain social media places, if they do Snapchat or they do Twitter or Instagram, be on those sites yourself so that you can see what your child is doing, because you might be surprised. You might think that your child's not going to throw pictures up that are inappropriate, but we cannot be naive.
Yes. And I think it's easier to keep your head in the sand. Like you said, it's easier to not think about it and pretend like it's not happening, and that just wishing that the world was like it was when you were growing up. But that's not helping anyone.
Right. And that we're just going to keep them in this little bubble, even if maybe they go to a Christian school and maybe we live in the South. I mean, I live in the Bible Belt, but let me tell you, these kids are exposed to the same kinds of things that everybody else is exposed to. Our son goes to a public school, and we are not naive to what he is what he comes in contact with. So the other thing is to always keep these conversations going. Make sure that your child feels comfortable coming to you, that you're not going to shame them if they come and admit to something. This relationship is just vital as they grow into their teenage years. You want to continue to keep these conversations going in a way that is loving them, that is allowing them to fail while they are under your roof. Because if you wait till they go to college and then they fail, they don't have anybody guiding them. Yeah. So you want to set up an environment in your home that you still love them. Even when they don't do everything perfectly, you allow them to make mistakes. You don't micromanage. You don't control everything they do. Allow them to make mistakes while they're in your home so you can guide them in ways that are helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. So very important. We have told our daughter so many times, just being honest with us is the most important thing. And that she's going to have a lot less of a consequence if she's honest when she shares, something that happened. So yeah, really key.
Exactly.
All right. So I know, Gayla, that you have the experience with step parenting. So can you share with us some of the challenges that you and your husband faced in becoming a blended family?
Sure. Some of the things I didn't recognize in the beginning, and I think that's the reason I am passionate about helping educate and offer encouragement to step parents, and not just step parents, but even the biological parent that is in the home is highly affected by things that are going on as you try to learn to parent with someone who is not your child's parent. One of the things that we had to really come to understand is the role that grief plays in step families. So if you think about it, every step family is formed as a result of loss. There's been some kind of an ending of a relationship. It's either been through divorce, it's been through death, a death of a parent, or maybe just an ending of a relationship that maybe the two were never married, but there's been some kind of loss that you have experienced, but also that your child has experienced. And then when you go into marriage, into a blended family marriage, and perhaps it's a second marriage for you, you're looking as a chance, a do-over, a second chance at marriage. And that was really my take. My first marriage was not a good marriage. It ended up, and I was in a relationship with someone who struggled with addiction. And man, there was just a lot of hurt and a lot of defeat. And I felt like such a failure when that marriage ended. And so when I looked at remarriage, to me, it was God brought someone into my life, a godly man who was going to love me. He was willing to take my girls in. And I was excited. It was a second chance at marriage for me. And yet my girls had to grieve the ending of their biological family. And they weren't quite so excited about having someone else come into this family. And particularly as kids are older, my girls were young. And so sometimes it's easier when kids were young. But, my stepchildren were 5 and 10. And especially my 10-year-old stepdaughter, she had a good relationship with her mom, and she wasn't necessarily interested in a relationship with a stepmom. She didn't need a stepmom. And so I had to really think about what was affecting her and how grief was playing a role for her, that when her dad married me, that solidified the fact that her parents would never be together again. So now she has to really come to terms with the final ending of that first family and then the beginning of a new family, even though his divorce had happened years prior. But the finality of it really happens when a parent remarries. And all of a sudden, you can't deny the fact that your parents are not going to get back together. So we just need to know that there's grief, and it's going to drive our children's behavior a lot of times. And again, similar to how I was talking about, we look behind the behavior as a leader. We do the same thing as a parent. We look behind the temper tantrums and the bad attitude, or maybe even in a young child, they digress in some behavior things, and have to consider, what's driving that behavior? What's going on? How can we talk about these feelings? And we have to open those conversations up because we're the adults. They're not going to. And I've also heard this statistic that kids are at least a year behind us emotionally as we're moving into these new relationships, and we're excited. Our kids are not at the same place that we are.
Yeah.
And we need to recognize that, and we need to offer them grace, be patient with them, and just continue to work on a trust-building relationship. As a step parent, you don't move into this big disciplinary role until you have formed a relationship. And that's where we get it wrong a lot of times, especially as stepmoms. We're used to being a mom, and we think that we're going to step into this stepmom role in the same way. And those kids aren't necessarily going to respond to you in the same way that your biological kids did, particularly not in the beginning, until there is a relationship that has been established. So those are some definite things that we need to consider. There's the phrase, rules without relationship results in rebellion. That
Yes.
can definitely be applied in step-family life.
Yeah.
We need to work on a relationship first before we step into this disciplinarian role. We need to be a friend, and we need to earn their trust before we can expect that they are going to allow us to be a disciplinarian with them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so helpful. So can you share anything that would be practical ways that if a woman is listening and she's a stepmom, ways that she can develop that relationship with her stepchild?
Yeah, do some fun stuff with your stepchildren. Be the chaperone at a field trip if you can, where it's not necessarily one-on-one, because sometimes that can be uncomfortable in the beginning if there's not a strong relationship. Maybe you can do something, so you're a chaperone. I remember doing this with my stepdaughter, and it was a canoe trip that we went on as part of her middle school adventure. And it was crazy because we were in a canoe together, and then the canoe tipped over and we both ended up in the water, and cold water.
Oh,
and
boy.
It was crazy, but we laughed about that. We had to learn how to get back in that boat together. So there was some team building that went on between me and my stepdaughter. And gosh, decades later, she and I can laugh about that, because that was a way that we built a relationship in a very non-threatening environment. And that's the thing that you want to remember, is you want to do it slowly and you want it to feel non-threatening. So it might be something that in the beginning, if you want to do as a family, but how can you be the good guy? How can you be the one who is able to really offer something that is a benefit to your stepchild? Another thing I did was I was a piano teacher, and my stepdaughter wanted to learn to play the piano. So I worked at being her piano teacher for a while. Now, It got to where that didn't necessarily work, because I was having to be kind of the bad guy about, listen, you got to practice if you're going to learn to play the piano. And, that's not the place I needed to be doing as a stepmom.
Right.
And so you just kind of have to, sometimes it's trial and error, but keep the concept in mind that I'm trying to build a relationship here in a non-threatening way. So what is the best way I can do that? Maybe it's she comes home and has had a bad day at school, and you just say, hey, can I cook you a batch of cookies? Would that help you feel better? Know your stepchild in a way that you can know what is going to minister to their heart. And whatever that is, then you offer that to them.
Okay. So helpful. So on the other side, I'm curious if there's anything that you see common mistakes that step parents make with their stepkids, and how to avoid those things, and maybe any examples that you have from your own experience.
Well, sometimes we're a little overzealous when we come in as step parents, and we so desire this close, snuggly relationship, and so we're going to push ourselves into this. Let's say that we're a really affectionate person, and we love to give hugs, and we see nothing offensive about giving hugs. And so every time we see our stepchildren, we're going to hug them, and I'm just so thankful you're in my life. Well, you know what? A prickly teenage stepchild, that may be the last thing that stepchild wants. And so you have to take cues from your stepchildren. And if they're not an affectionate person in the first place, and then you're trying to offer them hugs all the time when they don't really even know you, that is not going to bond with your stepchild. So it's really not being overzealous about trying to be affectionate or trying to offer things that is going to make them uncomfortable. So just recognize that you're going to take cues from them. If they're a 3-year-old and they enjoy sitting in your lap and you reading them a book, that's great. That's awesome. Do it. But if they're a 13-year-old, then you really have to pay a little more attention to the fact that it's very likely they're not going to want a hug from you every time they come through the door.
Right. And I think that goes for stepkids or biological kids or adopted kids, because again, it's a personality thing. Like certain kids just like certain ways of interacting more than others.
And certain moms have different ways that they interact more than others. But I think it is more important with stepchildren when we're trying to bond with them that we take the cues from them and that we don't try to just force ourselves on them if they're not ready.
Right.
But the other thing I will say is continue to work at that relationship, even if they're rejecting you. And that's not uncommon. If there's disharmony in their home, there's conflict, there's things, these relationships aren't coming together like you wish they would. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're failing. It just means that it's normal. It's normal to have some conflict as you try to bring these families together. But there's some real subtle ways that you can do this. Most teenagers have a phone. Even when, say, they are at the other house and maybe they spend a week over there, maybe it's a week at your house and a week at the other home, just send them a text a couple of days a week. Hey, how are you doing? Can I pray for you? Is there anything you need from me? Just very subtle, not forcing, just letting them know that you care about them. And those are things that are non-threatening. If you follow them on Instagram and they throw up a picture from their cheerleading event, wow, that looks like a great event. I hope it went well for you. Those are just little things that show them you're paying attention, you care, you want a relationship with them. They may not respond. They may just totally continue to ignore them, but we have to be the adults.
Yeah.
And as the adults, that means we continue to press in and pursue a relationship with them, even when we're rejected. And I can tell you as a step parent, more than likely you are going to be rejected as times. And it's hard. It's hurtful. Those are times I really had to push into my faith and realize that I'm loved by God at all times. Even when my stepchildren choose not to love me, even when I am trying to do everything I can to build a relationship with them, if they're not ready, they're not going to give back. And the other thing that we have to recognize is the role that loyalty ties play. So for instance, if a stepdaughter has a very close relationship with her mother, for her to love you as a stepmom feels disloyal to her. So that has nothing to do with you. That has everything to do with her and her own mother. And we have to just really be careful that we don't take things personally that are not about us, and that we just continue to do our part in building a relationship. Yeah. Research shows that it takes 4 to 7 years for step-family relationships to come together. So this is not something that's going to happen overnight. And that's why we have to really understand the concept of perseverance and know that perseverance does pay off. I'm a huge believer of that. Time is on your side as a step-parent. Just don't give up in those middle times when you want to.
Oh, wow. That's so much helpful wisdom there, Gayla, that I think will help any woman that's listening who's dealing with this situation. So you mentioned how you've had to press into your faith at different times. And can you tell us more about how your faith has impacted you as a parent, as a leader, and how that's benefited you in your life?
Certainly. And for one thing, a couple of scriptures that have been really meaningful to me that I think play out in the leadership role and also in a mom and stepmom role. And it has to do with asking for wisdom. James 1:5 is very clear about if any of us needs wisdom, we should ask God, and He gives to us generously. And we do need to stop and just ask God for wisdom. I didn't know how to be a stepmom. I didn't know how to be a human resources director at Coca-Cola. I didn't know how to be a wife the second time around when my first marriage failed. And yet God walks with me. And it takes intentional time of sitting before God, reading scripture, asking, I need your help here. This journey is hard. I need answers to this situation that is staring me in the face. And another scripture that has really become important to me is 1 Corinthians 1:25. And it says, for the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. So too often we pick up the phone and ask a girlfriend when we're having a problem instead of just going to God first, when he is so much wiser than anybody that we can ask. So that's one of my biggest things is I need to just stop and ask God for wisdom when I'm struggling and when the answers to what is going on, they just don't seem to come. Or maybe the waiting of, God, I've prayed about this. I've worked hard to have this relationship with my stepson, and yet he continues to just disregard me. And I don't know what to do about it. And I believe God will show us, whether it's through somebody's book, whether it's a relationship with somebody who is just a little bit further on the journey than you, whether it's a class that all of a sudden shows up at church that could be helpful for you. There's just so many different ways that God will speak into us when we ask him.
Super helpful. So, Gayla, let's talk a little bit more. You mentioned earlier about, how different personalities impact parenting. And I think that they also impact leadership. And I believe, and I think you do too, that God has made us all differently and that we can use our unique gifts and skills and passions, all in different ways. So I'd love to know if there's any tools or resources that have helped you discover how you're wired and how that has been beneficial to you.
Right. Yes. I like the Myers-Briggs test. I actually came across that when I was in graduate school. It was something that was emphasized using as we work with clients. And of course, we had to take it for ourselves first. And even at that time, I knew I was an introvert, but I wasn't familiar with the other things in that test that it kind of shows you. For people familiar with it, I'm an ISTJ. I'm not going to go through all of those, but people can look that up online and you can understand what that means. But, basically that just really helped me understand more about, for one, as a leader, I need to recognize my needs. And so for my needs, I need time to recharge. Sometimes if I have had a conference, for instance, where I am on go for 2 or 3 days, maybe even I'm speaking at it and you have people pulling at you. In order for me to do that 2 to 3 days in a row, I have to have some time at night. So maybe I can't go to dinner with the whole group and spend another 2 or 3 hours that night, or I will have nothing to give the next day. So if we are in situations that we know are going to be draining for us, then we need to figure out how do we compensate for that and what can we do to continue if that is how we recharge. Now, my husband needs to be around people all the time.
Right.
So if he spends too much time by himself, then he's going to end up flat. He's going to end up with no energy, and it's not going to serve him well. So, and he's a leader in his job also, and he understands what works for him and how he needs to be careful that he doesn't end up in situations where he is by himself. He could never be a writer. It would never work for him.
Right.
He doesn't even want to work from home in a quiet setting, maybe on a weekend if he has something he needs to do. He's going to go to the office when there's people up there because that's just how he thrives. Mm-hmm. And it's just so important for us to understand our individual personalities and what works for us and how we press into that. And honestly, it took me a while to really understand that about myself. Yeah. And man, once you do understand that, then it even makes a difference in what roles you take and what career path you take. Because if you are taking into account your personality, then you are going to be able to thrive in your job so much better.
Yes, that is so true. And this is something we talk a lot about here on the podcast because it's one of my passions too, is understanding our personalities and how that impacts everything in our life. So
Right.
we actually talked about the Myers-Briggs test on episode 8. If anybody wants to
Oh,
go back and listen to that episode, we talked about Myers-Briggs and a few of the other kind of frameworks that are out there. But it's funny because I actually am also ISTJ. And I don't usually meet other ISTJs, so
that's funny.
so it's nice to meet someone who has the same letters. And again, if you want to find out more, I'll put links in the show notes to the online test you can take, and you can learn more about that framework of Myers-Briggs. So
That's great.
yeah,
We need to hang out, Esther.
yeah. So Gayla, tell me how have you been able to embrace your identity in the way that God has created you, and also as a believer? Is there anything that you've done to help you really embrace and enjoy how God has created you?
I think for one, I began keeping a gratitude journal years ago that helped me see the blessings of what was going on in my life, even if I didn't understand it. And there are things that happen with us when we're praying for something to change, or maybe even it's a characteristic of ourselves that we want to change, and it seems like it's just not happening as quickly as we want. And in keeping a gratitude journal, I think it helped me, one, begin to know myself better, because I could go back and I could read this gratitude journal and I could see things that I was asking about over and over again. And it helped me recognize that I needed to take a different perspective, that sometimes there are some things that God is doing in our life, but we don't recognize them because we're too zeroed in on exactly what we think we need or we want. And God does know best. God is sovereign in ways that we don't always understand, or we understand later.
Right.
Hindsight is 2020, right? I mean, I'm sure you've heard that.
Yeah.
And so when we're in the middle of it, sometimes we just have to learn to trust God, trust His plan, even when we don't understand it. And I just feel like a gratitude journal helped me with that. And especially years later, when I can go back and I can look at it, I also keep a prayer list. I'm in a prayer group and we write down our prayer needs, and I can go back and see how those prayers were answered. And it's just so beautiful because our memory doesn't always serve us well. Since I've gotten older, my memory doesn't serve me as well as I would like. But if I
Yes.
have things written down, I can go back and I can read through them, and I can just see how God has worked in ways in my life that I didn't necessarily see it at the time, but I could go back and see how He used things in my life too. I'm a firm believer that we often grow the most in our spiritual walk in our darkest seasons.
Mm.
And it doesn't mean that we want to walk through those dark seasons, but I think we can know that there are always benefits to them. And we can look back and see it, how God has matured us in our walk. Maybe God has taught us how to have a better grip of self-control with a stepchild who just pushes our buttons over and over again. And we have to be the adult.
Yeah.
And in that, we can ask God to show us, what do I do? How do I change this in myself when I'm feeling like my buttons are getting pushed every day? And it's funny how God will show us, or God will teach us something to help us. And once we walk through that, then we can begin to see how God does change us, even in these dark seasons. And there's always benefits to what God is walking us through. So sometimes it's a matter of changing our perspective a little bit.
Right.
And I think that can happen through gratitude journals. Like I'm a fan of those.
Yeah, I just love that tip of keeping a written record of both your prayers, but also the things you're grateful for, because like you said, our memories don't always work properly. And I actually heard something recently that talked about the fact that our memory, every time we pull up a memory, the memory changes slightly. Like the actual
Wow.
act of pulling in the memory, it changes our memory. So the only way to truly remember from the moment, that something happened is to have it in writing.
Right. And our memory is also skewed by our experiences. So
Yeah.
let's say that somebody chooses to kind of play the victim role of, gosh, life is just too hard. And instead of owning up to their part of what is going on in that difficulty, they just flip it to, this person is unfair. This person treats me wrong. And so if those are the experiences, then sometimes our memories, they don't serve us correctly because we're seeing them through a lens that is a victim mentality.
Mm.
So sometimes the written page can help us see that, gosh, you know what? This sounds like victim thinking. How do I change this? When we see the same things written 2 or 3 days in a row or 2 or 3 weeks in a row, it's funny how maybe fresh eyes on a good day can help you see, gosh, my thinking is kind of skewed here. Maybe
Yeah.
I need to reconsider my perspective on this issue. So
Yes.
I
Yes,
think that's it.
absolutely. So let me ask you, Gayla, a lot of leaders that I talk to have a message that they want to share with the world. They have something that God has given them that they want to share, that they want to impact other people with. So can you tell us a little bit about what that might be for you?
I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned is it's okay to fail. Oftentimes if we're not failing, it's because we're staying in this safe little zone that is not necessarily healthy. I think about the story in the Bible of Peter when he went out to walk on water. He's the only one that got out of the boat to go walk on water. And we often point to his failure of he took his eyes off Jesus and he sank. Yeah,
Mhm.
you're exactly right. He did. But he also had the courage to get out of the boat and walk on the water. And do we have the courage to do what God has called us to do, even if it means that we fail at times? Because when we're embarking on new endeavors, we don't have all the answers, but we have to get out there and try something. Don't be paralyzed by perfection. Don't insist that until you have all the answers, you're not going to step out to what you believe God has called you to do. I would have never written a book if I had waited until I felt like I had every answer to everything in life. We just can't do that. We have
No.
to muddle through and do the best we can. But then the other thing is when we do fail, how do we respond? That's really what sets us up to either continue to pick ourselves up and thrive in a situation that maybe we didn't get everything right, or we create fear and insecurity in those that we're trying to lead because they see us maybe blame others or maybe not take ownership. And maybe we walk in pride instead of humility because we don't own up to our mistakes. That's just going to create insecurity in the people that we are leading. There is nothing that can serve us better as a leader than to walk in humility. And when we mess up, to just say, you know what, guys, I didn't make the right decision here. I'm sorry. I need to start over. Yes, there's going to be some consequences because of this decision that was wrong, but I'm willing to do whatever I can to dig us out of this hole. And that can just grow trust in people we lead better than anything. But in order to have that mentality, we have to have the courage in the first place to say, I'm going to step out even if it means that I fail.
Mm.
And if I do, then I know I can get myself back on track. I know how to do that. And if I have my people who work with me and they trust me, then they will help me get back on the right track.
Yeah. Yeah. Such good advice. And I think it applies to leadership, it applies to parenting, because how often do we make mistakes as parents? And we need to be able to say, I'm sorry, I messed up.
Mm-hmm.
And I find a lot of times we don't want to do that when we're the parent, right? We don't want to
Mm-hmm.
apologize.
No, we
So,
don't. And the other thing I want to reference, if when we have conflict, which we're going to have conflict,
Yeah.
is be sure that we do conflict in a way that can come to resolution. So be sure that you attack the problem and not the person when you're trying to resolve conflict, because you know how conflict can go. You start on one subject and all of a sudden you're dealing with something that happened last year at Christmas.
Yeah.
You know, how did that get into this conversation?
Right.
And so for one, stick to the issue at hand, but attack the problem and not the person in order to resolve the conflict that is going on.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yes.
man, we can say some really hurtful things that go really deep and we can't take those words back. Yeah, we can apologize, but those things are still going to play over in somebody's head if we have said them. And so we just want to be very careful. We had a Sunday school lesson just this last week on James and the tongue and how much damage the tongue can be. And, you know, I was just convicted about how there are times that I just need to be silent.
Yeah.
There's no reason I need to offer my opinion sometimes. I just need to keep it to myself.
Yes.
You know?
It's one of the most simple things, but it's one of the hardest things to do is to tame our tongue, which I think is why there's so much about it in that book of the Bible.
Well, and also why I think God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Yep.
You know, but do we listen twice as much as we talk?
Right.
Probably not.
Well, speaking of sharing our thoughts, I want to wrap up with just a couple more questions. So one is, if you could give any advice to a younger leader, someone maybe starting out in her role as a leader in ministry or in her career or as a parent, what would you tell her?
I would tell her to find a mentor if at all possible. That's not always easy, especially finding a mentor that can work with you and not charge you an astronomical amount of money. You know, it's nice if you can find one who just is passionate, maybe who really cares about you and sees some potential in you, and they are willing to walk along with you, preferably if it can be a Christian mentor, so they can also help you with the Christian values and things. But I just think to have somebody that's just a little further on the journey than you are can make such a difference, because sometimes we just need another perspective on what we're doing. Sometimes, you know, it's a heavy decision and we need to bounce it off of somebody. So if at all possible, that would be one suggestion, is to find a mentor.
Yes. And also, we just had an episode about mentoring. Episode 18 with Lisa Pulliam is all about, episode 19, all about mentoring. So if you're looking for more tips on mentoring, that's a great episode to listen to as well.
You cover all the great topics. You have this thing covered.
Oh, goodness. Well, we're trying. My last thing that I like to ask people about is the fact that leaders are learners, and we all can be constantly growing and learning as we lead. So is there any way that you prefer to learn? And is there something that you've been learning recently that you'd like to share with us?
I really prefer to learn through books, and I like hardcover books. I tried to do the whole ebook thing, and it just didn't work for me. And so I went back to reading print books, and partly because I can highlight, I can make notes in the margins that then I can go back and reread later as I'm kind of reflecting on my takeaway from the book. So books are my biggest form. I do listen to podcasts also. I think, especially for busy women, podcasts are just a great way for us to take it on a walk, take it in the car, whatever, just flip it on. Even you just listen to 10 or 15 minutes while you're in the carpool line. You know, there's just so many great ways and easy ways that we can listen to podcasts. I can't read a book while I'm driving down the road. You know, I can listen to a podcast. So I recognize the value in podcasts also. I'm actually currently reading a book by Christine Caine titled Unexpected: Leave Fear Behind, Move Forward in Faith, and Embrace the Adventure. You know, for me, I am in a new season with fixing to launch our child to college, which means we will be empty nesters. And I've been raising kids almost 3 decades.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a little bit of fear for me. And what is empty nest going to look like? And am I going to know how to do this without kids at home all the time? So I want to get a little ahead of that so that I don't just fall apart next fall when my son goes to college. And I really think I'll be fine. But at the same time, I'm somebody who likes to prepare for things. And that is part of how I am preparing for that.
I love it. Great. I'll put the link to that book in the show notes as well. So
Great.
Awesome. All right. So Gayla, I want to give you the chance, if there's anything that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to share, is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners?
I want to mention, this might be in the show notes when you put them up, but I want to mention the nonprofit organization that I co-founded and I lead called Sisterhood of Stepmoms. We are a nonprofit that offers annual retreats to stepmoms. We offer encouragement and hope on our Facebook page. It's just a great way. It is a faith-based organization. Mm-hmm. And we just want to offer encouragement and tips and tools to stepmoms because oftentimes the stepmoms do take the brunt of hard times. I'm not saying it's not hard for stepdads. It is. But society has put some expectations on moms that play over into the stepmom role also. And so there are some things that can make the stepmom role a little harder. So you can find that. You can find the website. You can find our Facebook page. But just you can find some encouragement there.
Okay. Yeah, we'll definitely put those in the show notes. So yes, awesome. So is there any other way that is best for people to connect with you if they want to learn more about you, your book, anything else that you're doing?
I have a Gayla Grace author page on Facebook, and then my website is gaylagrace.com, and you can sign up for my newsletter there. That's really the best way. I have just submitted a new book proposal. I have a new book idea that I've written a couple of chapters on. So, once you start this writing books, you're constantly in the mode of, okay, what am I going to write about next? So there are some things churning, and that's a great way to follow me.
Okay, awesome. Well, great. Well, I want to thank you, Gayla, for being on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. It's been such a joy to talk with you and to learn more about how God has worked in your life and what you're doing to help encourage other moms and stepmoms. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Esther. It's been great. I appreciate all that y'all do. This is a great resource.
Okay, friend, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. I especially loved Gayla's encouragement to us to keep an open and honest relationship with our kids so that we can be that safe place for them to share their needs and their concerns with us. I think that's what we want, not only for our kids, but also for anyone we are leading. So I think you can apply a lot of what Gayla shared today to not only your relationship with your children, but also relationships in your teams as well. So I want to thank you for sticking around, listening to this episode. I would love to hear your thoughts. If something from this episode impacted you, take a minute and share it with us. Let us know in our Facebook group or on Instagram if you want. You can find the links for those things right in the show notes. And I want to remind you, it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.